Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us through pandemics and storms for our town hall, Immigration, COVID, and Beyond. I am Ronnate Asirwatham, the Director of Advocacy at Lirs, and I will be your moderator for today. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. This town hall will be recorded, and we will send the recording and slides to you all. If there are any questions during this town hall, please do type them in the Q&A function. You can type them in at any time, but we hope to get to them at the end. Now, without further ado, let me pass this on to our new Vice President of Development, Andrew G. Steele, to open the town hall with a prayer.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us this afternoon and spending your time with us. We'd like to start our program with a word of prayer, so let us pray. Gracious God, we come before you this day as people yearning for justice, a nation in need of healing. We know all too well that the sins of bigotry, racism, and isolationism are thriving around us, but also in us. Sins that have risen with greater measure during this time of COVID-19. Help us to push back against these forces so that love and empathy might continue to take root. Help us to heed your call to welcome the refugee and migrant in our midst with care and compassion. Pour out your presence upon those gathered here today. Guide us to collective action in order to roll back these tides of injustice so that the seeds of abundant life might sprout forth. Be with us as we journey together in this holy work of welcome so that your peace is made manifest across this land. Amen. I would now like to welcome the President and CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, Krish Vignarajah.
Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. I think it says something incredible about this audience that even during these times of great uncertainty, everyone here is thinking about others and how to help. We had 1,000 people register and attending today. I know a lot of you are continuing to juggle challenges, whether it's working from home, trying to work from home while you're caring for your kids, your parents, your pets, your neighbors. So we really are grateful for your participation. I know we have had hundreds of participants listening. We have hundreds of participants listening today for the first time. So I'd like to begin by briefly introducing LIRS. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service began in 1939, resettling Lutherans displaced by the Second World War. But that mandate quickly expanded. We have responded to every major global crisis since then, helping to resettle and integrate refugees from Cuba, Vietnam, Uganda, the lost boys and girls of Sudan, and more recently, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We just celebrated our 80th anniversary this past year. I don't know if it's just Zoom that hides the wrinkles, but I am told that I hide our age well. We know our work has never been more important than today. Our support of refugees and other new Americans, asylum seekers, children, families really runs the range. And so I just want to share a few snapshots in order to give you a sense of it. Refugee resettlement is how we help refugees coming from all over the world through the UN system. When a refugee first arrives at the airport, they are greeted by LIRS partner staff. We bring them to a new home that has been prepared specifically for them. It's stocked with modest furniture, culturally familiar foods, and all the basic amenities of an American home. Adults are enrolled in English language classes, children are enrolled in school, and LIRS partners guide them through cultural orientation, using public transportation, and accessing community resources. We introduce them to their new neighbors, churches and other faith groups, and community organizations that play such an important role in providing each refugee with support and companionship for years to come. LIRS also does quite a bit of work along the southern border, and we have a particular expertise when it comes to children. For more than 40 years, we have supported unaccompanied children, basically kids traveling alone and arriving at our border. During the family separation crisis 2 summers ago, we were one of only 2 national organizations that the government turned to help reunify these families. Today, LIRS continues our critical efforts to serve children as we work tirelessly to reunite them with their US-based family members or sponsors as quickly and safely as possible. Of course, as our southern border has essentially been shut, our work with immigrants already here in the US has become even more important. We know immigrants are such vital and valuable contributors to our country. And so a substantial part of our programming focuses on the economic empowerment of immigrants. Our holistic workforce development programming makes sure that both immigrant youth and adults have access to English language learning, career counseling, and access to job and internship opportunities. Today, the pandemic has highlighted the essential nature of their work on the front lines. As healthcare workers, as aides in assisted living facilities, as agricultural workers. So here's just a few of the incredible statistics. 1 in 4 grocery store workers are immigrants. More than 16% of US healthcare workers are immigrants. And immigrants represent 28% of all physicians and surgeons in the US. Finally, we are focused on the climate crisis and what it means for migration. 2/3 of people who relocate their home today do so because of climate-related factors, and we know this number will only increase. We can't ignore these realities because lives depend on it, here at home and abroad. We are so grateful for our network of local partners who help us carry out this vital work of welcome across the country, and especially grateful for congregations and people of faith who truly embrace migrants as our neighbors and show us what the biblical mandate to welcome the stranger really means. And as you see today, one of our main priorities is advocating for compassionate immigration policy that empowers newcomers while restoring America's long legacy as a welcoming nation. I won't mince words on this though. It is a very dark time for our immigrant brothers and sisters right now. The US has hit rock bottom and accepted fewer refugees this year than at any other point in the history of refugee resettlement in this country. Asylum seekers at our southern border are being summarily expelled without due process, including unaccompanied children who are fleeing human trafficking and gang violence. Both families and individuals remain locked up in ICE detention despite the rampant spread of COVID-19 through ICE's hundreds of detention facilities. At one ICE facility I visited in Virginia, nearly 93% of detainees have tested positive for COVID-19. And the pandemic has taken both the livelihoods and lives of our immigrant neighbors, many of whom have been purposefully excluded from federal legislative relief packages. So we'll go into these issues more in depth. And kicking off this conversation, I don't mean to be all doom and gloom, because the truth is I'm not. Even in the face of all of this, call me crazy, but I remain hopeful. I remain hopeful because even in the midst of a pandemic, each of you has made the time to engage. I remain hopeful as our programs team works nights, weekends, for as long as it takes to make sure our clients survive this crisis. Because our advocacy team works around the clock to make sure our electeds in Washington don't target, but protect some of our most vulnerable. And I remain hopeful because of you, our supporters, who have sent countless messages asking how you can be of assistance. That's what gives me so much hope, knowing that we are not alone in this struggle, knowing that there are passionate, dedicated men and women across this nation willing to step up, willing to give voice to the voiceless. So truly, thank you for your support, and thank you for your willingness to take action on behalf of refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. We are so blessed to have you on our side. And so with that, let me pass the microphone to our Director of Advocacy, Ronnate Asirwatham.
Thank you, Krish, for that overview of LIRS work and our hopes for the future. Let me go over the agenda for the rest of the town hall. Next, I will speak on the COVID legislation, the gaps that this legislation was passed in March, and the state of play currently. Then Megan Bracey, our Director of Refugee and Migrant Services, will speak on refugee admissions today and the prospects for the future. Then we will have our guest speaker, Jennifer Quigley, Refugee Advocacy Director from Human Rights First, who will touch on anti-asylum regulations and the Remain in Mexico policy. After that, we will have actions for rebuilding the immigration system, and finally, the Q&A. So moving on to the COVID legislation, my colleagues will speak about how COVID has been used and abused to affect the arrivals of both refugees and asylum seekers into the US. But right now, I will speak about legislation passed because of the pandemic, creating policies that focus on immigrants and refugees who are already within the United States. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, Economic Security Act, otherwise known as the CARES Act, was passed in March of this year. It did have several policies that support migrants and refugees. But of course, it also had gaps. One of the gaps was the testing and treatment for all. The CARES Act covered testing and treatment through non-emergency Medicaid. Non-emergency Medicaid leaves out several categories of immigrants, such as those who have had green cards for less than 5 years, the undocumented, U visa holders, and many more. Another gap in the CARES Act was the stimulus check. To be eligible for the 1,200 stimulus check, you needed to have a social security number and not the usual taxpayer identification number, also known as the ITIN number. This left out a lot of immigrants and also US citizens who have immigrant loved ones. For example, if a couple had filed jointly and only one of them had a social security number and another had an ITIN number, then the entire family, citizen spouse and citizen children, did not get the stimulus. The final big gap was the issue of the US Citizenship and Immigration Services Office, commonly known as the USCIS. The USCIS provides immigrants with almost all of their documents: work permits, green cards, citizenship documents, and everything in between. They are traditionally a fee-levying office and have not asked for public funds before. But currently, because of the anti-immigrant policies prevailing in the US, it has cut down the total number of immigrants who need their services. Added to that, the USCIS themselves have become more of a vetting agency than a service agency, and therefore stifled the processing of documents. So they have lost revenue. Currently, the USCIS is saying that if they don't get funds by the end of August, they will have to furlough 13,400 employees, which again will cause delays and backlogs for immigrants. So, what is the state of play of negotiation for the current package? As you may know, the House passed the HEROES Act in June, and the Senate unveiled the HEALS Act just last week. The HEROES Act had a lot of what would support immigrants. The HEALS Act, not so much. Currently, the leaders are negotiating to bring these two bills closer together. So what are we as advocates doing to bring it together? While of course, putting forward our plans for our issues, we also support what we call marker bills. These are bills to test out ideas and voting patterns, and then if there's sufficient support, there's a push to add to the final legislation. So for example, right now, there's a bill in the Senate which is asking for the stimulus check for the spouses of citizens, but does not necessarily support the children of those with tax identification numbers. This bill will be retroactive. There is another bill that will support children as well as spouses of citizens. And that bill is forward-looking. So nothing is perfect and nothing is simple. But we hope we will get there, and we are frantically advocating for the support for policies that will uplift immigrant communities as well as citizens. And to be clear, what I've just spoken about are the policies that very directly impact immigrants. The bigger sticking points of the negotiation affect everybody. Funding for the post office, state and local government, and unemployment insurance. We continue to work on those issues as well as to ensure that the next COVID package will support all communities. And as ever, we will need your help in getting this done. I will discuss that when we get to the action segment. Now, after this deep dive into policy, let me pass on the mic to Megan Bracey, the Director of Refugee and Migrant Services at LIRS. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronnate, and thanks to everyone for being here. So, refugee resettlement during COVID. COVID-19 has been tremendously hard on our refugee and immigrant communities. As we know, it has opened our eyes to the disparities in our society across the board, and even more so in our most vulnerable folks. Many new refugees find their first jobs in industries that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic, causing unprecedented job loss and unemployment. This has led to an increase in stress and worry about how to pay the bills. Many, if not all, refugees have endured some sort of past traumatic experiences, which in times of intense stress can become even more amplified. We have seen a mixture of reactions to the pandemic, from the extreme of intense fear to the other side of dismissal. Both are just natural reactions fueled by past trauma or the fight or flight response. Additionally, we have seen an uptick in domestic violence, hospitalizations due to chronic mental health conditions, and we're also finding lots of challenges with accessing the right technology, honing our digital literacy skills and internet access so that families can operate in this new normal. Change the slide, please. Great. So we have made our response as best we could. And in response to these challenges, our network has continued to provide services to our clients. Some have done so in person at a safe distance while wearing masks, while others have done so through remote case management using different types of technology. WhatsApp has proven to be a great free platform for communication. Many refugees and immigrants were not eligible for the stimulus, as Ronnate shared. In response to the massive need for financial support, LIRS started the Neighbors in Need Emergency Fund to help our clients. In just 3 months, we were able to support 361 families with over $342,000 that went towards emergency needs. LIRS has worked hard to share the needs of refugees with our federal partners and advocate for more support during this time. And we have served as a hub for resources and information for our partners as well, and offered a 4-week case management training in June that was perfectly timely in order to really figure out how do we do remote case management in this new reality. Next slide, please. So, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program has historically received really strong bipartisan support as a life-saving program. Every year, the President, in consultation with Congress, sets the target number of refugees who will be allowed to enter the United States. This is called the Presidential Determination. You can see on the graphic on the screen that over the past 5 years, we have seen a substantial decrease in that number. It is crucial that the presidential determination is set at a number that reflects our commitment to serving refugees, even during the time of COVID-19. Without a number set, no refugee can arrive. The historical average has been 95,000 refugees per year. Ronnate will discuss actions you can take to help support a healthy presidential determination for the upcoming fiscal year, which starts October 1st. Next slide. Great. We are committed to continuing to welcome refugees, recognizing that the need for resettlement is immense. As Krish spoke about, today there are more refugees than at any point in recorded history. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, estimates that there's a record 79.5 million forcibly displaced people in the world, including 26 million refugees. It's kind of hard to imagine with such big numbers what that would really look like. UNHCR estimates that more than 1.4 million people worldwide are in desperate need of immediate resettlement. LIRS believes that the United States must remain a global leader and do all it can to provide protection for vulnerable populations. Refugees undergo strict medical screening prior to arrival, including temperature checks and a mandatory 14-day stay-at-home order once they arrive to the United States. And we have resettled refugees throughout US history, during recessions and other hard times. And they have always added ingenuity and innovation to our economy, our society, and our culture. In fact, during this pandemic, we have seen example upon example of immigrants and refugees answering the call to help as medical professionals, caregivers, and as other essential workers. We have the resources, we're ready to train, we have the tools, and we definitely have the will to resettle refugees in need. And I'll pass it back to Ronnate now. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Now let me introduce our guest speaker. We are honored to have with us today Jennifer Quigley from Human Rights First, an independent advocacy and action organization that challenges America to live up to its ideals. As the Director of Refugee Advocacy at HRF, Jennifer works to ensure the United States commits to refugee protection, both at home and abroad, including access to asylum protections and resettlement. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Ronnate. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on your call today. And so I'd like to share a little bit about the current state of asylum in the United States. For those who are unfamiliar, it's the companion system to resettlement for how refugees achieve safety and protection here in the United States. Unlike resettlement that brings the refugees here from abroad and greets them at the airport, asylum is the system by which if an individual feels as if they are fleeing persecution and need safety, they would get themselves here, whether that be through a flight or more commonly now arriving at our southern border. Many of them taking quite arduous journeys through many, many countries to reach that southern border, something that's become much more desperate as resettlement has shrunk, as Megan has alluded to. So this administration, right from the start, issued executive orders that both harmed the resettlement process as well as the asylum system. And we've gradually seen over the last 3.5 years, new policy after new policy being implemented by the administration to what we would consider a policy border wall, right? Instead of a physical border wall, it's a policy border wall to prevent asylum seekers from seeking safety and protection in the United States. This past March, on March 20th, the CDC, the Center for Disease Controls, issued an order creating, in effect, a border shutdown exclusive to asylum seekers and unaccompanied children. This replaced several other policies that had been in effect, one that I'll speak about shortly, Remain in Mexico, as well as what we call the asylum cooperative agreements that had the United States deporting individuals to third-party countries to have them seek asylum in those countries, most notably Guatemala, as well as Honduras and El Salvador. What we see now as a result of the CDC border shutdown order that has been extended every 30 days since March 20th is that individuals who show up at their southern border, whether it be at a port of entry or crossing between a port of entry, that they are expelled. There is no due process, as Krish mentioned at the top of the call. This is applied to adults, family units, as well as unaccompanied children. Without due process, these individuals are not transported to a third-party country. They are returned to their home country where they face persecution, the persecution by which they fled. So it's quite a dire situation currently for those who approach our southern border. In addition to that situation for those who've newly arrived, there is a myriad of different policies, particularly through the regulatory process that the administration has put in place to make it difficult for those who are already in the country and seeking asylum. This we've seen is taking place in several ways. So the first is regulations that change qualifications and fees for work authorization. So if you're an asylum seeker and you apply for asylum in the United States, what will happen is after 6 months, you're eligible to apply for work authorization. This is the only federal assistance that you have available to you as an asylum seeker. Some states provide access to other types of benefits, but only about half of the states. The regulations that will go in effect towards the end of August would state that the waiting period to apply for work authorization will be extended to a full year after you applied for asylum. In addition, those who crossed between ports of entry, right, so those who did not present themselves at a port of entry at our southern border, would it be ineligible for work authorization. And as for the past several years, it has been very, very difficult for any individual to get through at a port of entry. Most have had to cross between ports of entry. And so this is going to create quite a desperate situation for asylum seekers, resulting in little access to medical care, to food, to jobs, as well as housing. In addition to that, we saw just last week that the fee schedule, an updated fee schedule, so that's all the different fees that somebody who applied for any type of immigration benefit to USCIS, as Ronnate spoke about earlier, are seeing fees increase. And for the first time, we're seeing fees actually be applied to those who apply for asylum and apply for work authorization. So never in our history has anyone had to pay to apply for asylum in the United States. Now there would be a $50 fee starting in October. In addition, to apply for work authorization, that fee goes from $0 to $550. So imagine you spent all of your money trying to get here to seek safety and protection, and now you can't work and you can't access benefits unless you come up with $550, only after a year of waiting after applying for asylum. So the difficulties the administration have put forward month after month, sometimes week after week, have made it incredibly difficult. Where there are a few proposed regs that the administration has put out, and by that I mean that they offered up a 30-day period which the public could comment on a regulation that they would like to put into effect to make it even harder. And so those comment periods have passed most recently for what we commonly refer to as the Asylum Ban Regulation. It's a very large regulation by which those who would like to apply for asylum based on gender-based violence or gang-related violence would not be eligible for asylum. Most recently, and this comment period ends on October 10th, is what we call a public health asylum ban. Anybody coming from a country in which there is a number of public health outbreaks, whether that be COVID or tuberculosis or any number, they would be banned from being eligible for asylum. The good news, though, I will say, is that many things that have gone into effect have been stopped by litigation. Most recently, there was 2 wins in court cases for what we call Asylum Ban 2.0, or the transit ban. And that was for individuals who had passed through a third-party country that was party to the Refugee Convention, that they would be ineligible for asylum. That was halted by the courts in early July. And so there are some good moves that litigators have made and judges have agreed that this administration is taking these steps to limit and deny access to asylum in an illegal manner. And so we're hopeful that in the next few months that we will continue to see legislative victories against these illegal anti-asylum policies the administration has put forward. So what does this mean for those who were subjected to some of these policies that have been overtaken by others? So for instance, like I said, the CDC order has shut down the border to asylum seekers. Well, what does this do for those who were placed in the Remain in Mexico program? And so that's the program that's been in effect for about 1.5 years, in which an individual would show up at a port of entry or cross between ports of entry, and they'd be given what we commonly refer to as a notice to appear, a piece of paper telling them when their court date was, and then Customs and Border Protection or Border Patrol would send them back to Mexico and tell them they had to remain in Mexico and not come to the port of entry until their court date. And so there are tens of thousands of individuals and families who are still in this program and still stuck in dangerous border towns in northern Mexico, subjected to violence, subjected to COVID, little access to healthcare, And because of the CDC border shutdown, they cannot even come to the port of entry in the date that they have on their notice to appear for court. For many of them, that has been delayed indefinitely. Some of them get new court dates, but then the CDC order gets extended, and so their court dates get extended. And so they remain in legal limbo, in physical danger, in these northern towns in Mexico. So we're super grateful for the organizations that have taken on setting up legal help, humanitarian help, and medical help to those in this situation. So what do we do, right? So in addition to litigation, there has been an effort by advocates across the spectrum, human rights organizations, faith-based groups, sort of everybody that is concerned about making sure that the United States offers protection to refugees in need. And so we worked on a bill last year called the Refugee Protection Act. It's an update to the Refugee Act of 1980 that established our asylum and refugee resettlement systems, with input from many, many organizations, introduced by Senator Leahy and Representative Lofgren, as a way to reform, upgrade, update, and really from 40 years of experience, understand what type of system that we need to have now to update the Refugee Act of 1980. And so I encourage folks to look at this. We have plenty of materials that can be circulated. Get your representatives to support this so that hopefully in the new year, we will have a new opportunity to reform our refugee protection systems here in the United States. So I'll turn it back over to Ronnate.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And special thanks to Jennifer because she lost power today. The electricity went out because of the storm. And she managed to hold on to the battery of her phone and she saved it for today just to speak to all of us. So special thanks. Now, what we've all been waiting for, actions. So if you go to our website, or if you click on the link when you get the slides, you will first see the toolkit. So hopefully at the end of next week, all our lawmakers from the federal government will have passed the next COVID package and they will all have returned to their districts. The toolkits give you a step-by-step guide on how you could find the office closest to you and contact your member of Congress or their staff. So you could tell them how important it is to have a presidential determination, a high ceiling on the number of refugees that can be admitted to the US for the next fiscal year. The toolkit also tells you how to contact your state and local officials, like your mayor. So you could push them to push the president to make a determination to admit a robust number of refugees. You may ask why. This is so important that we must include everyone from the mayor to the president in this national determination. You have heard Megan and Krish talk about how important and contributing refugees are to this nation. But let's face it. Finally, this determination is about us, Americans, who we are as a people and our values. Are we generous and welcoming in times of crisis? Bishop Andy Taylor, the head of the Lutheran Bishops' Immigration Ready Bench, said by gutting the immigration system, we are actually robbing us of gifts we give ourselves. So that is why I ask you, please speak up. Make your values heard. The time is now for us to have a refugee admissions that are worthy of the United States of America. There are two other policy actions which are quick but time sensitive. That is to email your member of Congress. You will see action on legislation. So you can email your member of Congress to include immigrant priorities into the COVID package and support the Refugee Protection Act. That's what Jennifer was talking about, the new immigration policy, which gives security to both refugees and asylum seekers. Before I hand you over to Andrew for more actions and closing, I do want to remind you to type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to it soon. Thank you, and over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Ronnate. So, of course, we know you might be asking yourselves, well, what else can I do on top of that? And These might seem like simple things, but we still want to name them and claim them and ask that you do this as well. But first, of course, is pray. We believe in the power of prayer and that it's real, and that we ask that you continue to pray for refugees and migrants and God's work through LIRS. And we also ask that you pray for our elected officials and leaders in this nation whose decisions impact the lives of those we serve. Share the urgency. Do your family and friends, places of worship, your networks, do they know how crucial this work is right now? Share this presentation with them. In addition, though, just like Krish said, share the hope. There is hope, and we must remain hopeful. When you hear the good news, please share the good news, because victories in this work are important. Follow us on social media. I know this might seem like a small thing, but following LIRS on social media makes a difference. Like our pages, comment on our posts, retweet us, engage with us. We're trying to reach the world with this work. And by you engaging with us through social media, you'll help us do that. Host an event. Yes, this is the time of staying at home and virtual meetings, but you can still host virtual events. LRS, our staff would love to help you set these up again for your congregations or friends or families or networks. And potentially even a staff member could maybe come and staff your event and present. So we would love to help you do that if that's something you're interested in. And last, make a gift. In the end, we know that God doesn't need money, but God's work needs money. And this is God's work. And with all the uncertainty around government budgets and funding and welcome, the need has never been greater. We ask that you discern where you see yourself engaging in this work through your personal stewardship and investments. And thank you to all of those who are already invested in this work. So now, for more information, of course, go to lirs.org, our website. Stay engaged, send us your questions, and make sure that if you're not already signed up to receive our newsletter, that you are, and invite others to do the same. Forward the emails that you get from us with e-alerts and other updates so that we can get more people involved in this important work. And so with that, I will open up to the Q&A portion of our town hall today.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us. So there's quite a few questions on the question panel, and I'll send the first one to Krish. Does LIRS have any presence or connection with any of the organizations at the southern border?
Yes, we sure do appreciate the question. I'm really proud of how LIRS and our network has set up a border program as soon as we saw the need of families as they cross the border. We have what we call our Welcome and Respite program in New Mexico and Arizona. It supports families and individuals after they're processed by Customs and Border Patrol. So as they're coming out, sometimes, I remember when I visited Arizona a few weeks before, we had these poor families and individuals being dumped at a bus depot in public parks in the middle of the night with literally nothing but the clothes on their backs. So what we would provide is room, board, medical screenings, clothes, diapers, in some cases, even shoelaces, because while in detention, some of the poor children would have those taken away from them. And then we help them get to their final destination. And we would do this and recruit volunteers that represented an amazing interfaith coalition. And to me, the idea of these individuals, asylum seekers, exercising a legal right, coming to America and being welcomed by a Lutheran working alongside a Jew, working alongside a Catholic, working alongside perhaps a person who has, a religious faith, speaks to the kind of welcome that I hope our country at some point will continue to give.
Thanks, Krish. Next question is to Megan. What are the situations of the 1.4 million refugees in desperate need in refugee camps, inadequate shelter, food, health services, etc.? This detail would be helpful as I speak with others.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So each year the UN does determine and share in their reports as to how many refugees are in need of resettlement as they look around the world for places for refugees to be settled. The US historically has taken the largest share of refugees and supported them here. That unfortunately is not the current situation. Statistically, the UN cites that 450,000 people within the East and Horn of Africa region are some of the folks with the highest resettlement needs. And it would be fair to say that the majority of those folks are living in refugee camps, although it really varies. You'll see people who are in more urban settings, living kind of on the fringes of society, much like undocumented immigrants are here in the United States. And then many people who are living in very, very large, often insecure, unsafe refugee camps throughout Kenya. Uganda is currently the world's largest host of refugees, particularly related to insecurity in South Sudan. And they also host refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Somalia, from Eritrea, and from Central Africa. So that's the biggest region. That's followed by Turkey, who hosts, really hosts 3.7 million refugees. And out of that, 420,000 are deemed to be in immediate need of resettlement, meaning that they don't fit into the other two durable solutions that the UN looks at, which is repatriation, so being able to go home, or integration into the host country, which isn't always an option if the host country is unable to provide that. And in that case, majority of those refugees are Syrian refugees. And the rest are currently in North Africa region and Central Africa and the Great Lakes region. Again, it's a variety of situations, but a lot of people are living in refugee camps.
Great, thank you, Megan. We will stay with you for a second. And there's another question of why was only half of the 45,000 refugees resettled in the US in 2018?
Yeah, so the refugee resettlement program has been through a lot of challenges during this current administration. And that year, even though the presidential determination was set at 45,000, there were a number of stops and starts throughout the year and executive orders that halted resettlement into the country. Somewhere I have a PowerPoint slide with all of those dates, but I won't be able to come up with that right now. But we, would start resettling, and then immediately there was a 90-day hold on resettlement, and then there was a court hearing, and then that was overturned. And so there was a lot of stop and starts. And then additionally, we did see a lot of the actual processing of refugees overseas slow down tremendously during that year. So that impacted our ability to receive them on this end. So that was why, unfortunately, even though that number was set at 45,000, which at the time, to remind you, that was the lowest it had ever been set, we still weren't able to come close to it.
Thank you, Megan. And we will move on to Jennifer. The question is, could you expand upon the CDC border shutdown? How exactly are they keeping immigrants from crossing the border, and how exactly are they keeping immigrants from crossing the border?
So the way that they're doing it is twofold. First is if somebody approaches a port of entry who is an asylum seeker, they are turned away from a port of entry. So we call that turnbacks. The second is if somebody crosses between a port of entry and then typically would present themselves to Border Patrol. Border Patrol is expelling them. Mexico won't allow them back in. Of course, we do see that happen on occasion, but most notably they are being held in different facilities until they are put on flights that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, charter to return these people to their home countries. So that's the two ways in which they are keeping them out or expelling them without due process.
Thanks, Jennifer. And we'll go over to Krish. There's a question here about Chicago. I live in Chicago and have attempted to reach one or two agencies to become a foster family for children separated from their parents, and have had no luck in finding an agency that will assist in the process. Any recommendations?
Sure. Thank you for the question. We are always looking for foster care parents to step up. Just so you have a sense of what this entails, we have a robust transitional foster care program. And the idea is that as we are trying to reunite these children with their parents, we need to make sure that they are in a safe, small, family-centric environment. You know, as the mother of a 3-year-old, I know that all of these children, they're not just in our custody, but they are in our care. And I think that for parents, grandparents on the call today, we all know that that is the kind of environment. So that's where foster care parents are critical, because the alternative are these large shelters that essentially warehouse children. So if you go to the lirs.org website, and I will make sure that we also include this in the chat. But if you go to lirs.org/foster-care, you can actually click on a link that says Become a Foster Care Parent. I also know that there's one question about the children who are in family detention. And since this isn't exactly related, but somewhat related, I may just touch on this briefly. It is really a tragic event. We have had a judge, a federal judge, who has decided that the children must be released, and they actually needed to be released as of last Monday. But ICE has decided that they do not want to release the parents. And so the parents face an impossible choice of having to either release their children so they are out of harm's way and not detained in unsafe conditions, or they have to keep the children with them in detention. I highlight this because LIRS has had a longstanding history in terms of alternatives to detention. We have family case management programs, which would easily allow for these families to be released. And so this is an area that we have been very involved to try to avoid this Sophie's or impossible choice that these parents face.
Thank you, Krish. And I think there's a question for me about the stimulus check and why is it that way? So that's the way in the CARES Act, it was written that you need to have a social security number, and everybody on the form needs to have a social security number. And so with what is written in the CARES Act and then the implementation policies in the Department of Labor, where they specified that if the form would be rejected, if you don't have everyone doesn't have a social security number. Because of that, anybody, if you file jointly, you had to file exactly the way you had to file your taxes. So if you had filed jointly, or you had children who didn't have an ITIN number, a social security number, then nobody got the funding. That's the way it was written. I have another question from Megan. Given the situation now in the country, is it wise to let more refugees in?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I appreciate the question. I think it's a question on everyone's mind, the safety, and with COVID, it's very challenging to figure out what's safe and what's not. And I think everyone is struggling with that. I think from our perspective and from the perspective of the State Department, I think we believe that refugees are ultimately safer here during a global pandemic. To be in a overcrowded refugee camp where resources are extremely limited it's just beyond comprehension. So whatever we can do to help protect people in that situation, I know our partners on the ground are willing and ready to do. So that's our approach during this time. And we're certainly taking all the safety precautions, and we've been well supported by our friends and funders within the federal government and elsewhere to provide PPE, to make sure families are educated and oriented to what they need to know here, that they're well connected to medical providers here. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that they are being quarantined upon arrival and understand just what they need to be doing once they're here. So we do believe it's safe enough and should continue.
Thanks. And this question is to Andrew. What other things can congregations do to help support immigrants?
Sorry about that. Yes, of course. Well, again, prayer is the #1 thing. Depending also on where that congregation is located, and depending if they are members of the ELCA or what denomination, their church-wide office may have certain initiatives and programs in place. We're also working on creating more resources and toolkits for congregations on how to welcome and be welcoming congregations. And so again, stay tuned on our website for our resources through our outreach team, and also contact your local church affiliation group as well.
Thank you, Andrew. And then another question maybe for Jennifer. We now have $15,000 a year to help the students in El Salvador. It is to keep them there and to help them in their country. Is there more we can do now?
Yes, that's wonderful. We always believe in a dual prong approach to assisting individuals who are facing persecution, right? And so that is addressing root causes and providing them assistance in their home countries. And second, though, is considering that all of that is a very long-term prospect, that the decision to flee is an individual's decision to make. And so therefore there should always be their ability to seek safety and protection in the United States. That does not mean that that is the only solution. And so assistance to organizations for those who haven't fled, in addition to those who've been forcibly returned, is critically important. And there are a lot of organizations that provide assistance to those who were returned, even though they still face persecution in those countries. And so that's absolutely something that is worthy of support and is needed of support.
Sure, thank you. I think this might be for Megan. Of the refugees that you have helped that are staying in the US, are they staying here because they've just started to live in the US as citizens, or because the situation that they fled from has not been resolved?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's a complicated process. So for a refugee to be resettled anywhere in the world, the UN reviews different possible solutions for them. And they really do try to look and see, you know, first and foremost, could they go home? Because everyone wants to go home. But in a situation where that's not possible and integration into their host country is not possible, many host countries are often quite poor themselves and unable to really, you know, take on additional members to offer employment with. And anyway, so resettlement becomes the only option. So when someone's resettled here, they are on the path to becoming a US citizen. After 1 year in the country, they can apply for their green card. And then after 5 years, they can apply to become a US citizen. There's also programs for them to bring family that has been left behind. And so I would say for the most part, I don't see many refugees returning back home. Maybe in years to come, if the conflict changes and things become safe, you know, I think that's always a dream, of course, for people to visit or return back. But most make their home here, and they become Americans just like everybody else, and contribute, as we talked about, back into to the society here. So that answer.
Yes, thanks so much, Megan. Another question to Jennifer, I think, and then maybe I could add. Are there other supposed executive orders that can be replaced by a new administration?
Yes. And so there is an effort currently underway by many organizations, we call it the Big Book, to come up with our recommendations to a transition team about what the a new administration should do within the first 100 days to undo all of the Trump anti-asylum, anti-refugee, anti-immigrant policies. Of course, a big swath of those are repealing and replacing executive orders as well as regulations that the administration has put forward. It's actually a quite extensive list. There is an individual named Lucas Gutentag from Yale University who has an immigration tracker. He's tracked every single anti-immigrant policy the Trump administration put forward. When we pulled out just the ones focused on asylum, it totaled, I think it was between 13 and 19 pages. So you can imagine the amount of work that we need to do to undo. And so we're hopeful that as a united community, we can convince what we, of course, hope will be a new administration in January to quickly start that process of rescinding and revoking these executive orders and replacing the regulations with ones that are humane and, in our opinion, legal. Thanks.
Thank you. And there's a question of coordination. Maybe I should punt that to Krish. Do we work with HIAS and other Jewish organizations as well as other congregations?
We do. We know that it is critical, especially during the last few years when it has felt like a war on immigration and a war on immigrants, that we need the solidarity and strength of partners. I know that one person had asked a question about HIAS. I know someone had asked a question about EMM, which is the Episcopal Migration Ministry. All of these are critical partners of us. They are also resettlement agencies, but we're also involved in a number of coalitions through RCUSA and others. So that is kind of how we try to coordinate our efforts. We also have a national network, kind of a presence in nearly every single state. And part of that presence is through partnerships with Lutheran organizations, with Catholic organizations, with Jewish organizations. Just this morning, I actually had a council meeting of the CEOs of our network, and it was really an amazing, you could say, diverse coalition of these kinds of representatives.
Sorry, I was just getting my unmute button there. Thank you so much, Krish. There's a question on advocacy and, does letter writing help? And yes, there has been polls, there have been, practical solutions where we have actually seen people's lives being saved. But more than that, there are polls that both the most effective advocacy is through constituents writing letters now because the phones are not manned, but also giving a call to your congressman or state leader. That is one of the ways, the most effective ways to change this system. And this is also one of the only ways, or the US has the only way to do this. I mean, the other governments do not allow so much constituent power. This is a US specialty, exception. And so I think we need to definitely use it, and I would encourage you all to do so. We do have many more questions that we'll try to get to, but just as soon, maybe I think I'll just...
Do you mind if I just jump in?
Sure, go ahead.
I know that I've seen a number of questions on detention. So I just wanted to highlight, as an overarching policy matter, we strongly believe that the mass incarceration that we're seeing when it comes to immigration is in part a real result of the for-profit prison companies who thankfully have been pushed out of domestic criminal justice, thanks to criminal justice reform, now looking to immigration as their new profit center. And so when you look at GEO and Core Civic, who have made literally billions of dollars thanks to their ICE contracts under this administration, that I think is a reflection of one of the key dynamics of why we see millions, imprisoned right now. So we have a detention visitation program. So if you want to learn more about visiting a detention center, please stay in touch with us. We also launched during the pandemic a campaign called Hope Cannot Be Quarantined. We know that for many of the individuals who are still behind bars right now, they don't have access to water, basic essentials that the CDC has required, like soap. And so we were able to raise funding to help supply these commissary accounts so that they could buy soap. This is not what organizations like ours should be doing, but of course we need to meet the need today. So just wanted to jump in on that issue.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Krish. Thanks for everything. I know we're like 1 minute after the hour, and I don't want to keep you all. I know there's lots of questions, and we will try to answer them. You will have our emails at the end of this and with the slide, and you can send us in more questions. Both Andrew and I and all of us are happy to answer your questions, but I don't want to keep up the time. And I thank you very much. And we hope that we will be together again, and we will continue to work on these issues of refugees and immigrants as we go on. Thanks again.
Thank you.